Zoroastrianism is a very ancient but relatively unknown religion. It is still practiced by a small minority of people living mostly in Iran and India, but its real relevance for a class like this one lies in its supposed influence on the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. After the Babylonian exile, the Jews lived for a couple of centuries under Persian hegemony. This would have been from roughly 537 to 330 BC. 537 was when Cyrus the king first granted that the Jews be allowed to return from their exile in Mesopotamia. And then 330 was when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. So it's plausible that the Jews were influenced by the Persians during this period. Now, if you don't know where ancient Persia was located, here you can see it on the map. You can see that the empire was quite vast. In our day, it's no longer called the Persian Empire, but modern Iran is at the center of what used to be known as the Persian Empire. In fact, the people of Iran speak a language that they call Persian, and the name Iran comes from the term Aryan. So the people of Iran consider themselves to be the descendants of not just the ancient Persians, but also the ancient Aryans. Now, we've already talked about the Aryans in our discussion on Hinduism. The so-called Aryans are often thought to have migrated from an area just south or north of the Caucasus Mountains. This is really just a conjecture, though. There's lots of debate about where exactly these Aryans came from and what sort of routes they took. This slide sort of pokes fun at just how much disagreement there's been. What's not disputed is that there was, in fact, some people that migrated into all of these different parts of the world. Probably the most widely accepted view is that they came from just south or north of the Caucasus Mountains, as we saw in the lecture on early Hinduism. On this map, you can see that mountain range and the modern countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. So the Aryans are thought to have started here, and some of them migrated all the way out into the Indus Valley. Others settled in what would become known as Persia. Still others migrated into what would become Asia Minor, Greece, Russia, and Western Europe. Now, the reason that so many historians believe in this so-called Aryan invasion is because the peoples in all these regions, India, Persia, Greece, and so on, were culturally related. They're also genetically related, as we talked about. They spoke closely related languages, they built similar kinds of pottery, and many of their religious beliefs were closely related as well. There are lots of parallels, especially between the Hindu and the Zoroastrian religions. And we'll talk more about those a bit later. Okay, and in this class, I'm going to talk as much as I can about the reputed founders of each religion. In the first lecture on Buddhism, I told you about the founder of that religion. So let's look now at the reputed founder of Zoroastrianism. His name is Zarathustra and is generally thought to have lived between about 1400 and 1000 BC. Sadly, though, it's difficult to know much about him. Most of the surviving stories about his life come from traditions that are many hundreds or even thousands of years later than when the prophet himself is thought to have lived. His name may have originally had something to do with camels. He who manages camels, with aging camels, with furious camels. So maybe he was some kind of camel farmer, or, I don't know, camel racer? In any case, this Persian name came over into Greek as Zoroaster, which means undiluted star. This was probably because the Persians had a reputation as being very skilled in astrology. In the Greek way of thinking, the Persians would have most naturally learned this skill from their religious forebear. Now, as I said, there's virtually nothing that we know about Zarathustra's life. In later tradition, though, he was remembered as a religious reformer. Here's what we're told in Yasna 43. This is one of the oldest chapters of the Zoroastrian scriptures. You, Ahura Mazda, I recognized as holy. when your good thought appeared to me and asked me, 'Who are you, and to whom is your allegiance?' Then I answered, 'I am Zarathustra, to the false believers a staunch enemy, but to the righteous a mighty help and joy.' You I recognized as holy, O Ahura Mazda, when your good thought appeared to me. It seemed difficult to me to spread your faith among men, to do what you said was best. And when you said to me, 'To the right you shall go for teaching,' then you did not command what I did not obey. Make haste, come before my obedience, followed by treasure-laden destiny, who shall render to men individually the destiny of the twofold award. If your provident side, such as an understanding man who has the power would give to his friends, comes to me by the dominion through the right, then I will bestir myself to set myself in opposition against the foes of your law, together with all those who are mindful of your words." Now, I'm not sure how much we can deduce about Zarathustra's calling from this yasna, but according to later tradition, it's talking about when he took up his calling to oppose the priests of Mithra, to oppose bloody sacrifices, and to support the poor, and to preach that Ahura Mazda was the supreme god. Well, as I said, this was all later interpretation, and many would now dispute whether this one man, Zarathustra, really played such a significant role in the founding of a new religion. In fact, some would even dispute whether he was even a historical person. Jean Kellens, for example, says that we should abandon the whole notion of Zarathustra being a prophet and a historical founder of the religion. It's kind of a moot point anyway, Kellens says, if Zoroaster did exist, because even if he did, we can't really know what his role was in shaping Zoroastrianism. Now, Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, as he was known in the West, was remembered in much of the West as a wise sage with skills in such things as alchemy, astrology, and magical practices. So he shows up in lots of medieval lore and artistic works, such as this manuscript painting and this very famous painting by Raphael, known as the School of Athens. You probably already know that at the center of this painting are Plato, who's pointing up to the sky or heaven, the world of ideas, and Aristotle, who's gesturing down to the ground, the world of experience. Plato thought that at death, the soul flies off into the ether, so maybe that's another reason why he's pointing up. Aristotle was much more interested in studying the natural world. Well, but you might not have known this about the painting, though. Over in the bottom right, you can see 4 men. I don't know who the guy is that's wearing the white cap, but the guy with his back to us is Ptolemy. He's holding a globe Earth because he came up with the mathematical calculations to prove that the Earth is at the center of the solar system. Well, I guess it wouldn't be called a solar system if the Earth was at the center, but you know what I mean. The person looking at us is Raphael, and the guy next to him, holding the blue sphere, is Zoroaster. Many ancient philosophers believed that the universe was spherical. There's no early evidence that this was something that Zoroaster himself believed, but Raphael and apparently many others thought this about Zoroaster. Many early Greek philosophers, like Pythagoras, regarded the sphere as the most perfect geometrical form. So they inferred from this that the universe must be spherical. It's also why many of them thought that the Earth must be spherical. It wasn't so much because they thought that this was something that could be observed or proven through scientific discovery. In fact, it may not have been till Aristotle that people first started trying to prove that the Earth is a sphere through observations. But we're getting off topic here, so let's get back to the religion of Zoroastrianism. It's extremely difficult to reconstruct the origins and development of Zoroastrianism. This is due to the fact that so few early texts have been preserved, and due to the fact that these texts are so difficult to translate. The Zoroastrian scriptures are known as the Avesta because they were written in the Avestan language, which is similar to Sanskrit, the language of the Hindu Vedas. Like the Vedas, the old Avestan portions of the Avesta are very ancient, dating perhaps to sometime between 1000 and 800 BC, and some would even set their date to as early as 1400 BC. The Young Avestan portions are not as ancient. They date to sometime between 500 and 100 BC. But all of these dates are largely hypothetical and academic because the Avestan material was undoubtedly being altered through the ages. We can be quite sure about that because it was being transmitted orally all the way up to the 400s AD. Prior to that, it was passed down through liturgies and through other forms of oral tradition. Avestan had ceased to be a living language long before 400 AD. It probably ceased to be a living language by about the 1st century AD. And so I hope you can understand why interpreting the Avesta is notoriously difficult and often amounts to little more than guesswork. Translators have to rely heavily on later commentaries written in Persian and even classical works, usually Greek authors, just to make sense of what they're reading. Okay, now, among the primary sources for Zoroastrianism, the most important ones were written by the Zoroastrians themselves, and they would be these that I've listed here. First, we've got the yasnas, which can be divided up into 3 sections, or it's probably better to think of them as 3 different compositional strata. The oldest of these compositional strata are the Gathas. They comprise 17 hymns, mainly to Ahura Mazda, and all of these hymns are attributed to Zarathustra, the putative founder of the religion. And then there's another section of the yasnas called the Yasna Haptanhaiti, and this was also written in Old Avestan, so it's very ancient. It's not thought to have been written by Zarathustra, though. But like the Gathas, it's written largely as praise to Ahura Mazda, but then also to some other deities as well, like the Amesha Spentas, fire, water, and earth. And then lastly, we've got the Young Avestan texts, and these are just liturgical, exegetical texts, hymns, prefaces, and so on. But this material was written much later than the Gathas and the Yasna Haptanhaiti. And then we've got a body of scripture known as the Yashts, and these are mostly hymns to lesser deities, such as Mithra, Anahita, and the Amesha Spentas. These were written in Middle Persian rather than Avestan, and the word Yasht means prayer or worship. Certain Yashts, known as the Great Yashts, are very ancient and contain many of the themes and ideas that we find in Vedic literature. And then lastly, we have the Pahlavi literature. This includes Middle Persian inscriptions and a number of theological books that were finally redacted in the 9th century AD, but were obviously composed much earlier. These are mostly translations and commentaries on the Avestan texts. All right, now I'd like you to read some of the yasnas, the ones that I've printed here on the PowerPoint slides. The first one is basically a bunch of declarations about how the rituals were being performed on behalf of various deities in order to obtain their favors. And then Yasna 27 contains what's regarded as the most important prayer of the Gathas. That's found in section 13. In Yasna chapter 9, section 14, we're told that Zarathustra was the first mortal to have ever recited this prayer. And another important prayer is found in section 15. All of these prayers are written in Old Avestan. And then the last yasna that I'd like you to read is chapter 28. This is the first of the 17 Gathas that are attributed to Zarathustra himself. Now, as you're reading all of these yasnas, I want you to ask yourself if this sounds more like monotheism or straight-up polytheism. All of this Zoroastrian literature is problematic for reasons that I've already mentioned. We don't always know how to translate the Avestan texts, and even when we do, it's difficult to know how much of it reflects later tradition. Because of these things, we can sometimes get better insights into ancient Persian religion by listening to what the Greek authors had to say about the Persians. In fact, much of our earliest datable information about Zoroastrianism comes from Greek authors like Herodotus, Theopompus, and Plutarch. Historians also try to reconstruct Persian religion indirectly by comparing it with developments in other religions, such as Judaism and even Christianity and Manichaeism. Okay, so I hope you can appreciate that the study of ancient Zoroastrianism is fraught with a lot of uncertainties, from the translations of ancient texts to the origins of the religion and to its very unity as a religion. One of the most disputed questions in the field of Zoroastrian research is whether the preserved sources even represent a single Zoroastrian tradition or a number of different ones. One scholar named Albert de Jonge comments that the nature of our sources is such that there is no possibility for the writing of a history of the faith such as may be possible for Christianity and Islam. All right, so just keep those things in mind. There's a whole lot about ancient Zoroastrianism that we just don't know, and even what we do think that we know is often uncertain. So it's a bit like a giant jigsaw puzzle that's only been partially completed. Maybe in the future we'll be able to fill things out a bit more, but I suspect that there will always be many uncertainties. Well, these things being said, let's see if we can't draw at least a rough sketch of what this ancient religion looked like. As with many religions, the central figure was the priest. In ancient Zoroastrianism, this priest was called a magus, or plural magi. This is a Latin term that comes from the Greek magos. It's also where we get words like mage, magic, and magician. The Old Persian term, from which the Latin, Greek, and English terms are derived, are makush or magush. And this term in Persian is related to another term, maga, which indicates a particular state of ecstasy, possibly one that was drug-induced. So the Magi were probably known for ingesting a drug that put them in a state of ecstasy. Now, the central deity of Zoroastrianism is Ahura Mazda, but it's not entirely clear whether all of the Magi would have viewed themselves as devotees to this one god. They more likely had diverse religious commitments. Okay, and one very important ritual in early Persian religion was that of sacrifice. And here I think we can see a relationship with early Hinduism and many other religions of this part of the world. Now, in Zoroastrianism, sacrifice wasn't made on an altar. Instead, the worshiper would consecrate a patch of ground with a leafy bed and then sacrifice the animal right there on the ground. The sacrifice was offered to the fire and cooked. In Zoroastrianism, fire is a kind of deity. We'll see a bit later that one of the so-called Yazatas was named Atar, and he was a fire god and is comparable to Agni of the Vedas. Sacrifices were offered to other deities as well, and this sacrifice was regarded as an act of worship. Only the tongue and the jawbone of the animal were burnt in the fire. The rest of the animal was eaten by the priest and the worshippers. At the end of the sacrifices, another offering called haoma was prepared using milk, leaves, and juices that were obtained from another plant through the pressing of its leaves. This was obviously related to the soma ritual in Vedic religion. The word haoma means that which is pressed, but the identity of this pressed plant is uncertain. Many think it was ephedra or opium. Ephedra is a stimulant and opium is a hallucinogen. In the yasnas, the haoma is to be offered to the officially approved deities, such as Ahura Mazda, the other Yazatas, the fire, water, and so on. But the Greek author Plutarch seems to have understood the haoma a bit differently. He characterizes it as an offering to some underworld deity, probably Ungramainu, whom we'll discuss a bit later. The Persians, Plutarch says, pound up in a mortar a certain plant called molu, at the same time invoking Hades and darkness. Then they mix it with the blood of a wolf that has been sacrificed, and carry it out and cast it into a place where the sun never shines. Now, he's not talking here about the place where the sun don't shine. You know what I'm saying? He's talking about a cave or a well, maybe some underground place. Plutarch is presenting this as some kind of magical ritual. In Greco-Roman magic, this was what you would typically do if you had a curse or something, is you would put it in a very dark place, and usually a place that's underground. That way it would be closer to the underworld deities. All right, now Plutarch may be distorting things a bit, we don't know. It may be that he's not even talking about the haoma, but some other type of ritual that the Magi would perform. All right, and taken together, the singing of hymns, the sacrificing of an animal, and the drinking of the haoma, along with all the other attendant ceremonies, constituted what became known as the yasna ritual. This is not to be confused with the liturgical texts themselves, which are similarly referred to as the yasnas. The purpose of the yasna ritual was, in the first place, to offer worship to Ahura Mazda and the other deities, but this worship was also thought to ensure cosmic order. So you might think of that as a secondary reason for the ritual. If the ritual was not performed, there was always a threat that the daivas, especially Angra Mainyu, would cause chaos and disorder. The daivas were basically demons. So the yasna ritual was performed to sort of keep these demons at bay and to keep the world safe and orderly. All right, now I want to provide a lengthy quote here from an early Greek historian named Herodotus. Herodotus is very useful for us, I think, in trying to understand ancient Persian religion. He wrote about 450 BC and was the first person to write a history from a purely research-oriented perspective. Before Herodotus, history was written more as poetry and generally tried to push some kind of ideology. Not to say that Herodotus himself was ideology-free, but he was much closer to what we would regard as a true historian, or even closer to what we would call an ethnographer. He traveled much of the world, collecting traditions and relating the distinctive and often bizarre customs and beliefs of various peoples. And he's one of our earliest detailed sources about Persian religion, although his reliability is often suspect, so he needs to be read with some caution. All right, well, here's what Herodotus had to say about the religious beliefs and practices of the Persians. He says, "The following customs are those that I know to be observed among the Persians. They have no images of the gods, no temples nor altars, and consider the use of them a sign of folly. This comes, I think, from their belief that the gods do not have the same nature as humans, as the Greeks imagine." So straight away, we can see some very interesting parallels with Judaism, in that the Persians did not believe that there should be images of the gods. And Herodotus gives us his opinion that he thinks this is because the Persians didn't think of the gods as having the same nature as us humans. Herodotus was a Greek, so in his tradition, the gods were often envisaged very much like human beings. In fact, some would have said too much like human beings. The Persians rejected any such anthropomorphisms or theriomorphisms. And if you don't know what those terms mean, just read this slide. Now, it does appear that the Persians had lots of images of their gods. In these slides, you can see images of the gods Ahura Mazda, Anahita, and others. When exactly this convention was introduced is unclear. Herodotus can probably be cited as evidence that in the mid-5th century, the Persians were still largely aniconic. In other words, they still didn't have images. And a Babylonian priest named Berosus, who probably wrote around 285 BC, alleges that the Persian king Artaxerxes II had been the first to introduce cult statues in the temples of several important cities of his empire. Artaxerxes reigned from about 405 to 358 BC. Right, so continuing with our quote from Herodotus, "But their practice is to ascend to the summits of the loftiest mountains, and there to offer sacrifice to Zeus, which is the name that they give to the whole circuit of the firmament. So in other words, they identify Zeus with the heavens. They likewise offer to the sun and moon, to the earth, to fire, to water, and to the winds. From the beginning, these are the only gods to whom they have ever sacrificed. They learned later to sacrifice to the heavenly Aphrodite from the Assyrians and Arabians. She is called Mylitta by the Assyrians, Alalat by the Arabians, and Mithra by the Persians. Now Herodotus is obviously confused here in what he says about Mithra. The Persians did worship a god of that name, but he was male and can't really be compared with any of the gods that Herodotus mentions. He may have been thinking here about the goddess Anahita. She was really the most prominent of the female deities within the Zoroastrian pantheon. Notice as well that when Herodotus refers to the chief Persian deity as Zeus, he is speaking from a Greek perspective. He often does this in his writings. The god that he refers to here as Zeus is undoubtedly Ahura Mazda. Herodotus characterizes him as a sky deity, just like Zeus was a sky deity. And notice that he says the Persians also worship the sun, the moon, as well as the elements of earth, fire, water, and wind. So Herodotus obviously did not regard the Persians as monotheists. And he talks about the Magi sacrificing to the water in another passage as well. He relates that the navy of Xerxes, the famous Persian king that went to battle against the Greeks, was battered for 3 days by an intense storm until, quote, at last the Magi, by making victims, in other words, by making sacrifices, and chanting sorceries to the wind, and by sacrificing as well to Thetis and the Nereids, caused it to cease on the 4th day. Or maybe it simply abated of its own accord. That's Herodotus' commentary there. Here once again, Herodotus uses Greek names to describe Persian religion. By Thetis and the Nereids, he's referring to the ocean or the watery element. Notice too that Herodotus describes the Magi as offering sacrifices and chanting sorceries. The term for chanting sorceries here could also be translated as chanting incantations. These were prayers that were uttered in song and were thought to contain an inherent power that would affect, in other words, bring about the mage's purposes. Okay, a bit more about sacrifice. Like the Brahmins of India, Zoroastrians emphasize the importance of sacrifices, but they developed some distinctive rules about how to perform these sacrifices. Continuing now with our quote from Herodotus, to these gods the Persians offer sacrifice in the following manner. They raise no altar, light no fire, pour no libations, there are no flute sounds, no wearing of chaplets, no consecration of barley cake. But the man who wishes to sacrifice brings his victim to a spot of the ground that is free from pollution, and there calls upon the name of the god to whom he intends to offer. The sacrificer is not allowed to pray for blessings on himself alone, but he prays for the welfare of the king and of the whole Persian people, among whom he is naturally included. Now here we see an apparent contradiction with what we're told in Zoroastrian sources. Herodotus says that no fire is lit during the sacrifices and no libations are offered. But fire seems to have been an integral part of Persian worship. And libations were certainly offered, since these are mentioned quite often in the yasnas. So I think Herodotus is just incorrect about some of what he says here. Or maybe he's just talking about one type of sacrifice that he had observed. Anyway, continuing, he's talking still about the sacrificer. He says he cuts the victim in pieces, and having boiled the flesh, he lays it out upon the tenderest herbage that he can find, trefoil especially. When all is ready, one of the Magi comes forward and utters what they say is an incantation about the birth of the gods. Notice here that the flesh was to be boiled, but Herodotus just told us that no fire is lit, so how is that possible? Clearly he is confused here, but let's continue. It is not lawful to offer sacrifice unless there is a magus present. After waiting a short time, the sacrificer carries the flesh of the victim away with him and makes whatever use of it he may please. Here we can get a sense for the centrality of the priest in Persian religion. The magus was very similar in this respect to the Brahmins of ancient Hinduism. And I find this next bit interesting. The Persians regard it as unlawful to talk about anything that is unlawful to do. The most disgraceful thing in the world, they think, is to tell a lie. The next worse, to owe a debt, because, among other things, the debtor is obliged to tell lies. I'm not really following the logic there, but perhaps this helps explain why Zoroastrianism never really caught on here in America. The Persians also had an interesting policy towards lepers. If a Persian has leprosy, he is not allowed to enter into a city or to have any dealings with the other Persians. They say that he must have sinned against the sun. If any foreigners are attacked by this disease, they are forced to leave the country. Even white pigeons are often driven away as if they are guilty of the same offense. Notice here that what's translated as leprosy isn't what we typically think of as leprosy. We usually associate leprosy with Hansen's disease, which causes boils on the skin and makes various limbs to fall off the body. The type of disease that Herodotus has in mind here is probably something like vitiligo. It's the disease that causes your skin to turn light. Not completely light, but in patches. And this was interpreted as an indication that someone had sinned against the sun because the sun can make you turn tan, but I suppose the sun is so bright that if the sun is angry at you, it will cause you to have light skin. And this is something that can happen to both dark and light-skinned people. So contrary to what you may sometimes hear on the internet, leprosy in the ancient world was not white man's disease, as if being white meant that you were a leper. Yes, that's something that you can find being taught on the internet, but it's not true. Okay, continuing. This much I can declare of the Persians with entire certainty, from my own actual knowledge. There is another custom which is spoken of with reserve, and not openly, concerning the dead. It is said that the body of a male Persian is never buried until it has been torn either by a dog or by a bird of prey. There is no doubt that the Magi adhere to this custom, for they practice it without any concealment. The dead bodies are covered with wax and then buried in the ground. It's interesting to note how shocking Herodotus seems to have found this burial practice. It might be compared with the Buddhist sky burial, where the bodies of dead monks are laid out for vultures to eat. In this picture, there's actually a human carcass underneath all of those birds. Now, in the Buddhist practice, the carrion birds are allowed to pick off all of the flesh. But in the Persian practice, the dogs or the birds are only allowed to tear at the carcass, and then it's retrieved and buried. Herodotus also tells us that the Magi took special delight in killing certain kinds of animals and other creatures. The Magi are a very peculiar race, he says, different entirely from the Egyptian priests, and indeed from all other people entirely. The priests of Egypt make it a point of religion not to kill any live animals except those that they are offering in sacrifice. The Magi, by contrast, kill animals of all kinds with their own hands, excluding only dogs and humans. They even think it an action highly meritorious to destroy serpents, ants, and the different species of reptiles. This practice of the Persians flows from the idea that certain creatures are associated with the Daivas. These are like the evil deities. And the other creatures are associated with the Ahuras. These are the good deities. Some historians of religion have compared this notion with the biblical idea of clean and unclean animals. You can read about clean and unclean animals in Leviticus chapter 11. I would note, however, that the rationale for distinguishing between clean and unclean animals in the book of Leviticus and elsewhere in the Mosaic Law is very different from the rationale that the Persians would have invoked. Just listen to this quote from Plutarch. In fact, the Persians believe that some of the plants belong to the good god and others to the evil demon. So also among the animals, they think that dogs, birds, and hedgehogs, for example, belong to the good god, but that water rats belong to the evil one. Therefore, the man who has killed the most of these, they hold to be fortunate. Here, by the way, is a video of a water rat, in case you didn't know what those were. All right, well, but that was Plutarch. Plutarch was a Greek, and he was writing in the 2nd century AD, so why should we put any stock in what he says? Well, if you don't want to trust Plutarch, here's something from a Zoroastrian work known as the Greater Bundahishn. It says that Ahura Mazda created all the good animals, but then Angra Mainyu created all the poisonous and polluting animals. And then here's something from a Zoroastrian scholar named Marian Katz. Zoroastrians divided the animal world into Ahuric creatures, which were beneficial and pure, and Divic creatures, which were harmful and polluting. Most edible animals were considered Ahuric, and all Ahuric animals were permitted as food, with the exception of the dog and the cock, 2 animals that were the object of religious reverence among the Zoroastrians. Divic animals were primarily insects, reptiles, and beasts of prey. Domestic cats and elephants were also included in this category. In contrast to this, the Law of Moses doesn't forbid the eating of certain creatures on the grounds that they're associated with evil deities or demons. In the book of Genesis, chapter 1, all creatures are envisaged as having been created by God, and they're all said to have been evaluated by God as good. So the dietary laws didn't imply that certain creatures were inherently bad or evil. These laws had more of a symbolic meaning and a practical function, serving to encourage religious and cultural separation. By introducing laws that distinguish the Israelites from other peoples, the Israelites became more self-conscious about their distinctive calling as God's people. At least to some extent, the dietary laws prevented the Israelites from assimilating with the surrounding peoples, and in that respect, prevented them from unconsciously adopting pagan beliefs and practices. The Magi were also known for coming up with all sorts of magical potions and amulets that made use of things like bat's blood, viper heads, eyes of lizards, and so on. Here I've quoted a couple of magical recipes, as these are recorded in Pliny the Elder, a Latin writer of the 1st century AD. All right, and to finish off this lecture, let's look at another excerpt from a Greek geographer named Strabo. He reiterates a lot of what we've already seen in Herodotus. In fact, Strabo may have been dependent here on Herodotus. I'll let you pause the video and read it for yourself. He writes that the Persians had no statues or altars. Okay, that sounds a bit like what we saw in Herodotus. And they worship one god in particular, Ahura Mazda, whom Strabo, like Herodotus, refers to as Zeus, and identifies him as Uranos, heaven, again, just like Herodotus. But they also worship Mithra, whom Strabo identifies as a sun god, and they also worship the moon, as well as fire, earth, wind, and water. This is all the same stuff that Herodotus talked about. But unlike Herodotus, he explains that after the animal was sacrificed, it was taken away and consumed by the worshippers because the gods only require the soul of the animal. And you can probably sense here that aversion that the Persians had toward anthropomorphic notions about the gods. They probably didn't like the idea of the gods having to eat or consume material things like we human beings do. Strabo also mentions that the Magi were present at the sacrifices, touching them with their wands, singing incantations, and so on. Strabo differs from Herodotus in saying that the sacrificial ritual included the pouring out of a libation of oil, milk, and honey. Strabo's account, as we've seen, is more consistent with what we know from the Yasnas and other Zoroastrian sources. All right, in the next lecture, we'll talk about Zoroastrian gods.